This is the story of Mary, a woman whose silence was forced by chains, but whose defiance would erupt in the holiest of places. The narrator's voice carries heavy, steady, almost like an old bell tolling over a parish lost in time. Louisiana, in the early 1800s, was a land dripping in wealth for some, and drowning in misery for others. French Catholic culture blended with the cruel aristocracy of the plantation class, where lace and perfumes covered sins so vile they could not be spoken in polite company. And yet, those sins lived on the backs of the enslaved, carved into their skin, burned into their memory. Mary was one of them. She was forced to kneel in pews as a symbol of submission, her scars hidden beneath the pressed dress her mistress ordered her to wear. On Sundays, the church stood as a place of sanctity for the masters and mistresses who claimed their place before God. But for the enslaved, it was another theatre of humiliation. They were brought in not as equals, not as souls worthy of redemption, but as proof of their owner's piety. Silent, obedient shadows meant to bow, never to speak. The air inside was thick with incense and hypocrisy, where hymns rose in harmony while chains clinked faintly under wooden benches. Mary's mistress was always the centre of that holy theatre. She dressed in lace that shone like purity, her voice raised in song, her hands folded as though they had never struck. Yet only hours before the service, those same hands had left welts across Mary's body. She carried the marks into the church, hidden beneath fabric, her skin burning where the whip had kissed it. And still, she was made to stand close, to serve quietly, to embody the mistress's pride in her control. The narrator lingers here, pressing into the hypocrisy like a wound that will not heal. What was worship if the pews were filled with cruelty disguised as virtue? What was faith if the altar was raised upon the backs of those denied their freedom? The congregation sang of love and salvation, while outside the fields waited for bloodied hands to return to labour. Inside, Mary's silence became a living scream, a prayer unspoken yet louder than all the bells of Louisiana. This is not just her story, the narrator reminds us. Mary's story is one among thousands left untold. Voices buried in swamps and cotton fields, testimonies beaten out of bodies that still bore the weight of belief. And yet sometimes, the silence breaks. Sometimes, within the walls of the very house built for submission, defiance rises. Mary's story is one of those ruptures. It is the echo of a soul too long crushed, finding its moment to speak not with words, but with fire and steel. Mary's earliest memory was not of comfort, but of loss. She had been taken from her mother's arms before she could even understand the sound of her own name. A baby held close one day, gone the next, traded like fabric at the market. Her mother's cries swallowed by the thick air of Louisiana's fields. She grew up knowing her mother only through whispers, through the ache of women who hummed lullabies into her ears at night, trying to replace what had been stolen. Those lullabies carried the weight of Africa, of rivers and drums Mary would never see, but they were also hymns of survival, the only gifts the enslaved could pass on when everything else was denied. The sugar plantations of Louisiana were not fields of sweetness, but graveyards of broken backs. Cane grew tall and sharp, cutting skin with every movement, its green stalks drinking the blood of those forced to harvest it. Overseers walked the rows with whips coiled at their sides, eyes trained not on the cane, but on the people bent double beneath it. From dawn until nightfall, the fields screamed with the sound of labour, the crack of lashes, the guttural cries of those too exhausted to keep pace. The Louisiana sun spared no one. It burned until even the air shimmered with heat, but no mercy came with the sweat. Work ended only when overseers said it ended, and hunger was the only companion allowed to return with the enslaved to their quarters. For Mary, childhood was a word without meaning. Children carried buckets of water heavier than their arms, pulled weeds until their fingers blistered, swept kitchens while their stomachs twisted in emptiness. The mistress who dressed herself in lace for Sunday service stripped food from Mary's plate as punishment for the smallest mistake, a broken dish, a dropped spoon, a glance that lingered too long. Starvation became its own form of control, a reminder that even the right to eat was owned by someone else. The cruelty of the master and mistress was not hidden behind closed doors. It was performed like theatre. Punishments were public, designed to brand obedience into flesh and memory alike. Mary watched others tied to posts, their backs flayed until the air filled with the smell of blood and sweat. She herself was forced into those spectacles more than once, the mistress standing proudly to ensure every lash fell with proper weight. Children learned young what it meant to be made an example of. They carried those lessons in scars that never faded, each mark a sentence written across their bodies. Family bonds were not just broken, they were deliberately denied. Mary never knew the warmth of a father's steady presence, never had the safety of siblings to grow old with. The master sold people as easily as he sold sugar, tearing apart mothers from sons, husbands from wives, leaving only silence where once there had been laughter. The quarters where Mary slept echoed with grief, with the muffled sobs of women whose children were gone by sunrise. That silence seeped into Mary's own bones. She learned not to expect permanence, not to trust that anyone she loved would be there tomorrow. The narrator's voice turns heavy here, reflecting on the psychology of a childhood lived in chains. To grow up knowing you are owned is to live with a shadow that follows every breath. Every step Mary took was measured, every word weighed, because the cost of defiance was written in blood. Imagine a child who cannot run freely, who cannot cling to her mother, who knows before she knows herself that she belongs not to her family, not even to her God, but to the whims of cruelty dressed as law. That was Mary's inheritance. Childhood was not a sanctuary, it was a training ground for survival. And in that survival, a seed of defiance was planted. Quiet, small, but alive, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. The mistress was a woman who, to the public eye, embodied refinement. She dressed in silks imported from Europe, wore pearls that gleamed against her pale neck, and carried herself with the air of someone destined to rule over others. At church she bowed her head gracefully, lips whispering prayers, voice lifted in hymn. Neighbors described her as pious, a model of Christian devotion, but behind the carved doors of her house, away from the gaze of her congregation, she revealed a different face, one of cruelty sharpened to perfection. Her hands, soft in public, were merciless in private. Her voice, sweetened for fellow aristocrats, turned venomous when it fell upon Mary. Mary learned quickly that mistakes, even the smallest, were unforgivable. Once, while pouring tea for visiting guests, her hand trembled, and a single drop spilled onto the lace tablecloth. The mistress's smile never faltered before her guests. But when the parlour emptied and the door shut, her wrath erupted. She seized Mary by the arm, dragged her into the kitchen, and without hesitation plunged a ladle into a pot of boiling water. With deliberate cruelty, she splashed it onto Mary's forearm. The skin blistered instantly, searing pain that stole her breath. The mistress watched without flinching, eyes cold, as Mary cradled her arm. "Perhaps now you'll learn the worth of steady hands," she said, voice calm, as though nothing more than a lesson had been delivered. Sundays were never spared from her punishments. On the morning of worship, when others prepared for peace and prayer, Mary often bled. One particular morning stands carved into memory. Mary had risen early to polish the mistress's shoes, but a faint streak of mud remained on the leather. The mistress saw it as she prepared to leave for Mass. In her hand was a riding crop, thin and cruel, meant for horses, but often redirected toward Mary. Without warning, she struck across Mary's back again and again, each lash delivered with precision. Mary bit her tongue until it bled rather than scream, knowing a cry would only fuel the mistress's rage. And then, without allowing her even a moment to wipe her tears, the mistress commanded her to walk behind the carriage to the church, welts fresh beneath her dress. Even within the house of God, Mary was not allowed dignity. Her punishments often extended into the sanctuary itself, carried out under the guise of religious penance. The mistress would order Mary to kneel on the hard wooden floor for the entirety of the sermon, her knees pressed into splinters, her body trembling from exhaustion. Each time she shifted under the weight of her pain, the mistress would tap her sharply with a gloved finger, a silent warning to remain still. Worshippers around them saw only a servant dutifully kneeling, never guessing the torment wrapped in that posture. To them, it looked like devotion. To Mary, it was another chain disguised as holiness. The hypocrisy of the mistress hung heavy in the air like incense. She sang hymns with a voice as sweet as the stained glass light that fell across her face. But only Mary knew the cruelty hidden in that song. She lifted her hands in prayer, while those same hands had moments before left bruises across Mary's body. Her lips spoke of mercy and forgiveness, yet her heart craved control and domination. The narrator pauses here to lay bare the sharp contrast. How many in that congregation admired the woman for her grace, while blind to the screams she silenced behind closed doors? Mary's life became a cycle of cruelty and facade. Each day began with orders barked like insults. Each night ended with punishments masked as discipline. She was not simply a servant. She was a vessel for her mistress's fury, a living canvas on which pain was painted again and again. The world outside saw refinement. The enslaved within the house saw the monster. The weight of those years pressed upon Mary like an iron brand. The scalding water had left scars that never healed, faint ridges along her skin that burned whenever she remembered. The riding crop welts etched stories across her back, each one a silent testimony no court would ever hear. And the endless hours kneeling in church, forced to look upon the altar as if God himself endorsed her suffering, carved into her a question that would not let go. If justice did not live in heaven, where could it be found? The narrator's voice turns dark and deliberate. By morning the mistress sang hymns, but by night she was the executioner of her own household. To the world, she was the embodiment of piety. To Mary, she was the embodiment of hell. That duplicity was more than cruelty, it was blasphemy. And in that blasphemy, the first sparks of Mary's revenge began to burn. The church bells rang across the Louisiana parish, summoning rich and poor, master and slave alike. But even in the house of God, the line of chains was never broken. The enslaved were forced to attend Mass, not as equals, not as worshippers in their own right, but as shadows kept to the back pews, standing or kneeling, where the polished eyes of white parishioners could not be disturbed. They were displayed there as proof of obedience, their silence an ornament to their master's supposed piety. Every bow of their heads was not devotion but coercion. Every whispered amen was heavy with survival. Mary sat among them, her body stiff with the ache of scars fresh and old. She could smell the wax of the candles, hear the rich tones of the choir rising toward heaven, but for her the sound was hollow. The mistress, seated in the front, draped in lace and perfume, was the center of the performance. People admired her delicate voice, her calm grace, her perfectly folded hands. None of them could see the whip marks hidden beneath Mary's dress, or the burning humiliation carved into her spirit. Mary's heart was a battlefield. She had been taught to pray for deliverance, to bow her head and ask for freedom of the soul. She had whispered to God in the dark of the slave quarters, her hands clasped, her voice trembling with the desperation of someone who had nothing else to cling to. Yet as she stared at the stained glass windows, she felt rage coil tighter inside her. The glass told stories of saints and martyrs, faces of holy women crowned with light, men who defied empires for their faith. But Mary's own hands bore a different gospel, the gospel of scars, welts, and burns. She could not reconcile the mercy preached from the pulpit with the cruelty lived in her own flesh. Each sermon felt like a mockery, a holy mask pulled over the face of sin. The narrator's voice falls into poetry. The church was filled with the music of faith, but Mary's soul carried a different song. It was the rhythm of chains dragging across the floor, the thud of whips against backs, the cries that stained the air outside of sanctuaries. For every verse of forgiveness sung in Latin, there was an unspoken verse of suffering written in blood. She prayed, yes, but each prayer twisted into something new, less a plea for mercy, more a cry for justice. Around her, the enslaved shared her silence, though their eyes spoke volumes. When Mary looked at them, she saw the recognition there. Mothers who had lost children, men broken by labor, girls bruised by punishments that never ended. They knew her pain and she knew theirs. They did not dare speak openly. The walls of the church were filled with ears, but in glances, in fleeting touches, they passed their solidarity. Their whispers came not in words, but in the subtle hum of a field song, a tune carried softly on breath, its meaning hidden from the ears of the mistress, but burning like fire among those who understood. Mary's presence among them was not invisible. She was young, but her silence carried weight, and they could sense the storm rising in her. The quiet recognition in their eyes was not just sympathy, it was a kind of waiting. They had seen others crumble, but Mary's stillness was sharp, edged like a blade. She knelt as commanded, bowed as forced, but her gaze lingered on the altar with something dangerous behind it. She prayed not only for deliverance, but for reckoning. The narrator reflects on this inner conflict, on how faith in chains becomes a paradox. What does salvation mean when the one leading you in prayer is also the hand that whips you? What does grace mean when it comes wrapped in cruelty? For Mary, faith was not extinguished, but it twisted. It grew heavy with anger, sharpened by betrayal, waiting for the moment it could no longer be contained. The church carried on with its rituals. The mistress continued her hymns. The congregation bowed their heads in comfort. But for Mary, each passing sermon was another spark striking against the stone of her heart. And in the silence of the enslaved, in their secret recognition of her suffering, she realized she was not alone. The whispers of their eyes told her what the stained glass could not, that holiness was not in submission, but in survival, and perhaps one day in defiance. The morning began with the smell of bread rising in the kitchen, but for Mary there was no warmth in it. She stood over the fire, her back damp with sweat, her body weary from the endless chores of the night before. The mistress entered, her voice sharp as the crack of a whip, scolding Mary for being too slow, for daring to look tired, for existing in a way that displeased her. Mary bowed her head, knowing resistance was useless, but that humility did not shield her. The mistress's anger had been simmering from the night before, and now it spilled over. She seized the whip kept by the kitchen door, thin leather meant for livestock, and lashed it across Mary's back. Once, twice, again. The pain split through her skin like fire. Blood soaked into her dress as the lashes deepened, each stroke deliberate, meant to scar as much as to wound. Mary's body jerked forward, but she clenched her jaw, refusing to scream. The blows stopped only when the mistress grew tired. She looked at Mary's torn back, satisfied, and with a voice as calm as though nothing had happened, commanded, "You will come to Mass. You will stand behind me and serve as you are told, and you will do it with your head bowed." Then she left, her shoes clicking across the polished floor, leaving Mary trembling in silence, blood still dripping down her spine. The narrator lingers on this moment, painting it not only as a punishment but as a ritual humiliation. To drag her to the house of God, wounded and bleeding, was not enough. The mistress wanted Mary to carry her pain in silence, to be a living symbol of obedience. But beneath Mary's bowed head, something stirred that had long been building. The humiliation burned hotter than the lash. The injustice struck deeper than the wounds, and the silence she had carried for so many years now felt unbearable, like a weight crushing her chest. In the quiet of the kitchen, while the house prepared for worship, Mary's eyes drifted to the counter. There, among the utensils and tools, lay a knife, ordinary, meant for cutting bread and meat. Her hand reached for it instinctively, fingers wrapping around the wooden handle. The steel gleamed faintly in the morning light, its edge catching a sliver of the fire's glow. For a long moment, she held it close, listening to the sound of her own heartbeat. Each thud echoed louder, syncing with the distant toll of the church bells calling the parish to gather. Her breaths came slow and heavy. She thought of the whip, of the scalding water, of the endless nights of hunger, of kneeling until her knees bled while the mistress prayed for mercy she never gave. She thought of her mother, ripped from her arms, of the children sold at auction, their cries echoing down the dirt road. And she thought of God, silent through it all, while those who inflicted torment lifted their hands in worship without consequence. Rage filled her chest like fire, spreading through every vein. It was no longer a question of if she could act, but when. As the family prepared to leave for church, Mary dressed in silence. Her back stung with every movement, fabric pressing against her raw skin, each step a reminder of her wounds. The mistress walked ahead, head high, her lace dress flowing, pearls resting perfectly against her neck. To any other eye, she was a vision of grace, a woman of faith on her way to honor her God. But to Mary, she was a monster wrapped in silk, a demon cloaked in light. The carriage rattled down the dirt road, carrying them to the church. The mistress spoke idly about the sermon, about the guests who would attend, as though the blood drying on Mary's back did not exist. Mary sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, but her mind was elsewhere. Beneath the folds of her dress, hidden from sight, the knife rested against her skin. She could feel its weight, its coldness pressing into her thigh. Her fingers brushed it once, twice, as if to reassure herself it was real. Each time the church bell tolled, her grip tightened. The narrator's tone grows sharp, deliberate, building the tension like the tightening of a noose. Mary's silence was no longer submission. It was the silence of a storm gathering on the horizon. Her humiliation boiled into something unstoppable, something sacred in its fury. Every lash she had endured, every scar written across her body, every forced prayer whispered through clenched teeth, all of it had led to this. By the time the carriage reached the church steps, Mary's heartbeat was steady, strong, resolved. She stepped down carefully, bowing her head as expected, her hands folded like the obedient servant. No one saw the fire in her eyes. No one guessed that beneath her skirts, against her bleeding back, she carried not just pain, but a blade. As the bells tolled again, louder now, she walked behind her mistress into the house of God. The congregation would see only another Sunday service, another hymn rising to the rafters. But Mary knew. Her silence had ended. Judgment was coming, and it would not come from heaven. It would come from her own hand. The church doors opened with the heavy groan of wood, and sunlight spilled into the sanctuary as the congregation filed in. Men in tailored coats, women in bonnets and lace, children clutching their parents' hands, all took their places in the pews. The air was sweet with incense, the organ's opening chords swelling into a hymn that rose to the rafters. To the eyes of the parishioners, it was another Sunday, another chance to polish their souls before God. They knelt, they sang, they murmured prayers. None saw the storm that had walked through those doors in silence, carrying a blade hidden beneath folds of cloth. The mistress glided forward to her pew near the front, the place reserved for those of wealth and reputation. Her dress shimmered white, trimmed with lace, pearls glinting at her throat. She leaned close to Mary, her lips curling as she hissed through her teeth, too low for others to hear. "Keep your eyes down. Do not shame me today." Her words struck like another lash, another cut meant to remind Mary of her place. Mary lowered her gaze, not out of fear, but to hide the fire burning there. The sermon began. The priest's voice carried through the vaulted space, solemn and measured, speaking of forgiveness, of mercy, of the blessings bestowed upon the faithful. His words echoed through the stained glass, painting saints in glowing colours across the faces of those who bowed their heads. Mary stood just behind her mistress, her hands folded neatly before her, body aching from the wounds still fresh upon her back. Each movement made her wince, but her jaw stayed tight, her eyes fixed not on the altar, but on the place where her mistress's neck curved from her shoulders. The narrator draws the scene with a slow, suffocating detail. The choir swelled again, voices rising in unison. Kyrie Ellison, Lord have mercy. Yet mercy had never been given to Mary, nor to the hundreds who filled the pews behind her, their chains invisible but unbroken. The organ notes lingered in the air, heavy, like the beating of Mary's own heart. Thud, 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 each beat louder, syncing with the tolling of the church bell that had not yet stilled outside. She could feel the weight of the knife pressed against her thigh, its wooden handle warm now, almost alive. The mistress shifted slightly in her seat, her skirts rustling. She glanced back once, narrowing her eyes at Mary as if to remind her of the morning's lashings, as if to say, "Remember who you serve." Mary's fingers twitched. The hymn ended. Silence fell as the priest's sermon began in earnest, his voice measured, speaking of sin, of judgment, of the day when all would stand before the Almighty. And in that silence, Mary knew her moment had come. Her hand moved slowly, deliberately, beneath the folds of her dress. The knife slid free, the metal cool and steady. She gripped it tight, her pulse racing, her breath shallow. The narrator's voice slows here, like the world itself had paused. Every sound became sharper. The scrape of a shoe against the wooden floor, the cough of an old man, the whisper of a prayer from the back pew. Yet for Mary, all faded into silence, but for the pounding in her ears. She stepped forward, close enough to smell the perfume on her mistress's neck, sweet and cloying, masking the rot beneath her skin. The mistress turned slightly, her lips parting to scold again, but the words never formed. In one swift, furious motion, Mary plunged the blade deep into her mistress's chest. The sound tore through the sanctuary, a gasp, a choking cry as the knife found its mark. The mistress's eyes widened, her hands clawing at the white lace, now blooming red. Chaos erupted. Screams filled the church as parishioners leapt to their feet, pews rattling, hymnals falling to the floor. Blood spread quickly across the fabric, a crimson flower unfurling in the center of the mistress's dress. She staggered forward, collapsing against the wooden pew, her pearl necklace snapping, beads scattering across the floor like lost prayers. Worshippers fled toward the doors. the organ's pipe still vibrating with the last note of mercy, while the reality before them was judgment. The narrator leans heavy on symbolism. In the house of God, Mary delivered judgment. The altar was not the only place of sacrifice that day. The mistress's blood stained the same floor where she had forced Mary to kneel in false penance. The congregation's hymns were drowned by cries of terror, and the hands that had inflicted scars, that had poured boiling water, that had wielded whips with glee, those hands now trembled, clawing at their own chest, powerless at last. The priest shouted for order, his voice lost in the storm. Women clutched their children. Men stumbled backward in disbelief, some trying to rush forward to restrain Mary, others too shocked to move. But Mary stood rooted, her breath heavy, her eyes unblinking as she watched the mistress collapse. The knife was still in her hand, slick with blood, glinting in the fractured light of the stained glass above. For one brief, eternal moment, time held still. The saints in the glass seemed to look down, their coloured faces frozen in witness. The congregation stood between prayer and panic, between faith and fear, and in the centre of it all was Mary, the enslaved woman who had turned the sanctuary into her battlefield. The mistress's final breath rattled out, her body crumpling onto the polished wood. The sound of it echoed heavy, final. Silence followed, broken only by the sobs of those who had never seen blood spilled so close to the altar. Mary did not run, not yet. She stood tall, the weight of years of suffering pouring out of her in that single act. The narrator's voice darkens to a whisper. Her knife was not merely steel, it was the voice of the silenced, the cry of generations, the fire of every scar. Then, as shouts rose and hands reached toward her, Mary turned, her dress marked with both her blood and her mistress's. The pews rattled as people rushed away from her path, as if the very force of her defiance pushed them aside. She walked down the aisle slowly, her steps deliberate, her face calm, even as chaos consumed the church behind her. And when the heavy doors swung open and sunlight poured across her, it was as though she carried judgment out into the world itself. Mary burst from the church doors into blinding daylight, her chest heaving, blood sticky on her hands and dress. Behind her, the sanctuary had dissolved into chaos, screams, prayers, the sound of frantic footsteps echoing against the stone walls. The mistress lay still upon the pew, her lace gown soaked red, while the congregation scattered in fear. But Mary did not look back. She clutched the knife, her legs carrying her forward with a strength born of desperation. The road that led away from the parish opened into the wild edges of Louisiana, and she knew she had only moments before the alarm would be raised. The bell that had called them to worship now tolled in warning. Its iron voice rang out across the fields and bayous, summoning patrols, summoning hounds. Within minutes, men would be on horseback, dogs at their heels, hungry for her blood. Mary's breath came ragged, but she forced herself onward, her body burning with exhaustion, her back raw with the morning's lashes. Yet with every step, she felt something she had never known within the walls of the plantation house. Freedom, however fleeting. The swamps opened before her, dense and dark, the air thick with rot and the hum of insects. She plunged into the mire without hesitation, her bare feet sinking into the mud. Mosquitoes swarmed her face and arms, stinging without mercy. Snakes slithered through the reeds, their bodies rippling in the shallow water. The stench of decay clung to everything, the heat suffocating, the mud sucking at her legs as though the earth itself sought to pull her down. Yet none of it frightened her more than chains. The swamp, with all its terrors, was freedom compared to the plantation's polished floors and iron grips. Behind her came the sound she had feared, the distant baying of hounds. The patrol was already gathering, voices carrying through the trees, shouts echoing across the wetlands. She pressed deeper into the swamp, crouching low, her knife still gripped tight. The dogs barked, closer now, but the reeds and shadows closed around her like a cloak. She moved silently, each step calculated, as if the swamp itself had become her ally. The narrator lingers on the brutality of the swamp, painting it as both punishment and sanctuary. Every mosquito bite was a sting of survival, every leech a reminder of what it cost to be free. The mud weighed her down, but it also muffled her steps. The snakes that curled in the water hissed warnings, but they did not strike. The swamp was cruel, yes, but it was not cruel like the mistress had been. It demanded struggle, but not humiliation. It marked her with filth, but not with chains. As night fell, the swamp grew even darker, the cries of strange birds haunting the air. Mary crouched beneath the cover of cypress trees, her body trembling with fatigue, her stomach hollow with hunger. The dogs had passed once, close enough that she could hear their panting, but the thick mud and twisting waterways confused their trail. She pressed her back against the bark, closing her eyes, listening to the rhythm of the swamp. For the first time, she felt the weight of her own decision, the enormity of what she had done. She had struck down her mistress in the house of God. She had broken the silence forced upon her since childhood. The narrator ties Mary's flight to a larger story, one whispered among the enslaved, the Maroons. These were men and women who had fled into swamps and forests, carving hidden lives from the wilderness, building secret villages where patrols dared not tread. They lived with the snakes, with the mud, with the mosquitoes, but they lived free. Mary was now part of that tradition, her steps echoing those of countless others who had refused to bow. She was no longer just a runaway, she was a story in motion, a myth being born in real time. To her former owners, Mary became something else entirely. A ghost. The mistress's blood had consecrated her rebellion, and the swamp had swallowed her whole. The patrols would tell stories of seeing her shadow in the reeds, of hearing her breath in the mist, of finding nothing but silence where dogs swore they had caught the scent. The master's household whispered her name with fear. The congregation shuddered when they remembered the knife, and overseers tightened their grip on their slaves, afraid the legend might spark more flames. But Mary was gone, carried into the swamp's embrace, her body battered, but her spirit unbroken. The narrator's voice deepens. She had vanished into the wilderness, but in truth, she had become larger than life. Not a runaway, not a servant, not a shadow. She was judgment, walking barefoot through the mud, her fire hidden in the reeds, her defiance carried on the night air. To those who searched, she was a ghost story. To those who suffered, she was hope. Word of what Mary had done spread faster than the patrols could chase her shadow. Within days, whispers travelled down the rows of cane and cotton, slipping from mouth to mouth in hushed tones that overseers could not silence. They spoke of her with awe, fear, and trembling pride. Mary, the one who struck her mistress at the altar. Her name was not shouted. It was sung under breath, tucked into the rhythm of work songs, carried in the low hum of voices that seemed harmless to white ears. But those who knew. A hymn about rivers might carry her name hidden in its verse. A field chant about freedom might weave her act into its refrain. She became more than a woman. She became a spark. For the enslaved, Mary's defiance was more than rebellion. It was a message. If she could strike in the house of God, if she could raise her hand against the woman who seemed untouchable in her lace and pearls, then perhaps the chains around them all were not invincible. Around campfires, under the veil of night, they told her story as though it were scripture. A woman beaten, scarred, silenced, who chose her moment and delivered judgment not in a whisper, but in blood. To many, she was a saint of another kind, one born not from the church, but from the soil of suffering. The narrator connects her act to the larger tide of rebellion swelling across the black world. In whispers, people recalled the Haitian Revolution, where enslaved men and women had risen up, wielding machetes and fire, and driven their oppressors into the sea. Haiti's victory had lived on in secret conversations, proof that empires could fall. And now Mary's act joined that memory, a thread woven into the same tapestry of defiance. In Virginia, not long after, Nat Turner's rebellion would shake the South, his visions and fire carrying the same spirit Mary had kindled in Louisiana. These were not isolated moments. They were part of a greater storm, each act feeding the next, each defiant cry echoing louder. On plantations where lashes fell daily, people held Mary's name like a talisman. A mother might whisper it to her child as she rocked him to sleep, her voice low, her eyes darting to be sure no overseer heard. A man in chains might murmur it to his brother before dawn, as they bent to the fields. Mary who struck her mistress. It was a reminder that they were not only victims, but also capable of rising, of fighting back. The overseers could strip flesh, they could shatter families, but they could not stop the fire of a story once it began to burn. The songs carried her farther than her feet ever could. In the rhythm of hoes striking soil, in the clap of hands that kept time, her defiance was hidden in plain sight. To outsiders, it was nothing but melody. To those within, it was a secret hymn of resistance. She struck at the altar, they would hum. And though the words were disguised, the meaning was clear. Mary's act was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone still bowed under chains. The narrator's voice deepens, heavy with reverence. Her body may have disappeared into the swamp. Her face may never again be seen by those who loved her, but her spirit became immortal. She was no longer flesh and blood, but legend. A myth of fire carried secretly in prayers, in whispers, in songs that outlived the lashes. In the silence of the quarters, when the moon hung high and the fields lay still, voices would rise softly, blending her name with the names of the free, the brave, the fallen. And in that chorus, Mary lived on. Her act was more than rebellion. It was prophecy. It told the enslaved that judgment could come, not from the heavens, but from their own hands. It told them that even in the holiest of places, chains could be broken. And so her story spread, carried on the wind, growing each time it was told, until Mary was no longer just a woman of Louisiana. She was a symbol, a reminder, a fire that would not go out. The story of Mary cannot be told without stepping back into the wider shadow that birthed it. Slavery in Louisiana and across the American South was not only a system of labor, it was a machine built to crush the human spirit. The chains were visible, yes, but they were only one layer of the bondage. There was also the constant starvation, the deliberate tearing apart of families, the whip made into spectacle. There was the humiliation of being forced to kneel not only before masters, but even before God, as if heaven itself had been stolen and claimed by those who held the lash. It was more than cruelty. It was psychological warfare, designed to make the enslaved believe they were less than human, to smother the thought of resistance before it could even spark. Every scar on Mary's body told the story of that system. The scalding water poured on her arm was not an isolated cruelty. It was the daily reality of those who lived under a mistress's rule. The riding crop on Sunday mornings was not just discipline, it was ritual degradation. The forced penance in church was not only humiliation, it was an attempt to make submission into worship. All of it was meant to teach one lesson, that she had no power, no name, no self outside of her chains. And yet, she proved them wrong. Mary showed that even in the darkest corners, courage survived. Beneath the silence forced upon her, a fire had smoldered. Beneath the lashes, beneath the songs twisted into chains, beneath the weight of years stolen from her, something within her refused to bow. Her act in that church was more than a moment of rage. It was the eruption of a spirit that no system, no whip, no doctrine could kill. The enslavers had believed they had erased every possibility of defiance, but Mary's knife carved open the lie. The narrator's voice turns poetic, acknowledging that history may never give us every detail of her life, nor tell us with certainty what became of her after she vanished into the swamp. What remains is the echo of her defiance. That echo is louder than any silence imposed by chains. It is the reminder that even when the body is beaten, even when the mind is starved of hope, the soul can still rise. Mary's story is not only about cruelty, though cruelty surrounds it like shadow. It is also about the flicker of light within that shadow, the stubborn refusal to be extinguished. She carried the pain of countless others, and in one terrible, decisive act, she gave voice to all of it. The congregation may have seen only chaos, but the enslaved saw something else. A vision of possibility, a glimpse of freedom in defiance. Her body vanished in the swamp, swallowed by mud and mist, beyond the reach of patrols and dogs. But her defiance did not vanish with it. Her defiance rippled like thunder across generations. It lived in the songs sung in whispers, in the courage of rebels who came after, in the memory of every scarred back that refused to bend. Mary was gone, but Mary was everywhere. She had turned chains into fire, silence into a scream that would echo through history. That was Mary of Louisiana's story, a woman who turned Sunday worship into her battlefield. In a world where she was meant to bow, she stood. In a place meant to silence her, she raised her hand. The church bells that once called her to submission became the rhythm of her defiance, and the sanctuary that once humiliated her became the stage of her judgment. She was one voice against an empire of cruelty, one act of fire against a world built on chains. And yet, that one voice was enough to shake the walls of silence, Slavery sought not only to enslave bodies, but to enslave souls. It taught obedience through hunger. It carved lessons into flesh. It broke families as though love were disposable. It forced men and women to kneel beneath crosses wielded by those who had no mercy. But Mary's act tore through that illusion. She reminded the world in blood that even under the harshest cruelty, courage survived. She proved that resistance could rise from the most unexpected corners, that even those beaten down since childhood could stand in the holiest place and say, "Enough." Her story is not simply a tale of rebellion. It is a mirror held to the past, forcing us to see the raw truth of what was endured and the fire that answered it. The plantation owners called themselves masters. Mary showed them they were not untouchable. They sang hymns of mercy while wielding whips. Mary's knife exposed their blasphemy. She was not only striking at her mistress, she was striking at the lie that slavery could erase humanity. The weight of her act is not confined to one moment in history. It lives in memory, in the courage of those who came after her, in every whispered song and hidden prayer that carried her name. She became a symbol, not because she asked to be, but because her defiance demanded it. She is a reminder that silence is never the end, that chains can break, that even the smallest flame can set the darkest night on fire. So now it is left to us, the listeners, the witnesses, to carry her story forward. If Mary's courage reached you, share her name, speak it aloud, write it down. Let others know what she endured and how she answered. Comment with your thoughts. Share this story so it is not forgotten. Keep her fire alive in the places where silence still tries to rule. Because every act of remembrance is resistance against the erasure that slavery tried to impose. Remember her name. Remember her fire. For every scar left in silence, she carved her answer in blood. And long after her body vanished into the swamp, her defiance still thunders across time, a storm that can never be silenced.